When THX came out with their AAA amplifier technology, it promised high-end performance at a low price. The mass drop, or now drop, THX 789 amp was the first one commercially available. At only $400 for the measured performance, it seems like a crazy bargain. But does it make high-end amps redundant? To find out, I connected it to high-end sources such as the Shida Audio Yggdrasil and the Chord Hugo 2 and compared it with amps that are both under and over $1,000. I used headphones such as those from Massdrop, like the Sennheiser HD6XX behind me, as well as high-end headphones such as the Meze Empyreans and Focal Utopias. And I have to say the results were quite interesting. For your $400, you get quite a bit of amp. Starting with the power supply uses a 24-volt brick, which I've got sitting behind my desk, so I won't show that at the moment. Unfortunately, I don't have an alternate 24-volt power supply to test whether their claim that their negative feedback circuit eliminates all distortion really works, although the measurements say it does. But I'm going to take them at their word for that. The interesting thing is it uses a soft power on and off. So you press this button, it doesn't click or anything, but activates a circuit which allows the power to flow through the amp, and it will shut off automatically after about an hour. However, you can bypass that with this switch on the back, so it will stay switched on the whole time. Also, if you yank your headphones in and out, I found it will automatically engage a protection circuit. A little red, the light on the front, which is normally white, will switch to red for a second to stop you shorting the circuit and damaging either the circuit or your headphones. Now, onto the front is where you get the most features. It has a balanced headphone output. Now, while the whole amp internally isn't fully balanced, this is not really a major issue, although some people seem to think it does. It doesn't matter in practical terms. But you do get two single-ended outputs that use half the output circuit. So you have about 3.5 watts of output via the balanced and about half that roughly using the single-ended outputs. The useful thing though is that you have 3 gain levels. You have a low gain level which makes the amp very suitable for IEMs, a mid gain level which is roughly what most people would use for normal headphone output, and a high gain output if say you have a source with either very low output or you have headphones like Hi-Fi Man's HE6s or the Susvaras and need all that full 3.5 watts of power to go out to your headphones. And then of course it has your usual input switch, which is annoyingly unlabeled, so I always forget which I'm switching between the Yggdrasil or the Hugo 2, and then your volume pot. And the volume pot and other bits, well, let's take a look inside and see what's actually in there. For my look inside the 789, I propped the board up this time because the board is very shiny. Hello there. And the light just reflects off it and whites everything out. Having a look, it does look very complex, but there are still some basic things going on here. You'll notice, of course, there are huge gaps. And I'm guessing Massdrop has settled on one particular case size and design to make it easy to make a variety of components. And if they want to make a bigger and more complex component, they have space to do so. One thing to note though is they could have put the power supply inside here. There's more than enough room for a transformer in the power supply, or basically the contents of the wall wart, even if it was just a switching power supply, as presumably the wall wart has. But they've decided to go for a wall wart, and I guess the whole amp relies on its feed-forward kind of active negative feedback circuit to minimize any distortion caused by the power supply or any other design simplifications. And it's kind of very apparent to me in the design. So starting with the power, actually, it comes in here, of course. Then we have a little power group in there for some kind of rectification of the DC input. We want to smooth it out. Normally there are capacitors also included that to kind of smooth out the power supply, but I guess they found they made no difference with the feed-forward circuit. Normally you do have some kind of capacitance on the power supply to can ensure that the power supply to the circuit is consistent, so that even when you have a sudden peak in the music when a lot more power is flowing through, the power supply isn't suddenly drained of power and can't keep up. And that can cause flatness in the sound. But they've decided, of course, that's not necessary, and I guess these capacitors affect that have some of that effect in the design. So we see the power coming through these traces through to the amplification circuit, and we have a switch here which is whether you want the auto power off, and that is probably connected by traces maybe on the other side or in the board through to this little circuit up here. This is where you have your switch to engage the power. Now we have a soft power circuit here. and it has a little chip in there which detects if audio is playing. I guess there's some connection through from the audio circuit, and when audio stops playing, maybe there's some kind of timer built in, maybe to one of these chips, which after a certain period of time, depending on the setup, it will automatically power off. Now then we have the analog parts, and it does get a little bit complex, as it's a balanced amp, but apparently the circuit internally is mostly or partly single-ended. Now one shouldn't get fuss over this. It's just something it's just one of the many kinds of designs you can have, and it doesn't really matter much in the end whether the internal parts are balanced or single-ended. It's the rest of the design that's kind of more critical. So we have balanced and single-ended inputs, and we see these five cream-colored things which are relays, and we actually have a gap for space for one more as part of the circuit, but I guess was unnecessary for one reason or another. And these obviously are used to switch between balanced and single-ended. So when this is engaged or disengaged, depending on which I always forget which is single-ended, which is the balance setting because it's not written. These will be switched out. Now, of course, balanced means these positive and negative signals don't come into contact with the ground, whereas the single-ended circuit, it does. So you need that switched out when you're switching between balanced and single-ended, because you don't want ground crossing in there where it shouldn't, otherwise things will go wrong. So normally with the input to an amp, we'll say if it was just a single-ended amp or just a balanced amp, it would come into the volume pot directly usually, and then the volume pot would supply a certain amount of the signal to the amplification signal and that's where the gain would be controlled for the most part. The thing is here, this volume pot is only single-ended. It only has 3 contacts on the bottom. There's a double version which is doubly as thick and has 6 contacts and 2 controllers in there, which would make it balanced. Now since we have a balanced input, now they can't see the signal, the traces on the board here, and they're not underneath. It appears to be a multi-level board, and these little dots along here seem to be where the traces for the signal come in. These it's obviously the signal, if it's balanced, is converted to single-ended first before being fed to the volume pot. So that means there's a small chance that you could overload actually overload the balanced input. Say if you had a source that used had an excessively high signal, which I don't think there is anything in terms of balance that there is in single-ended if you use some chord products. If you did use like an RCA to XLR converter, it is possible that you could overload the conversion circuit here. So it's something to be slightly note, and it has happened with some amps like Audio GD, which they have the volume controls after a gain stage. You can actually overload the input, whereas a normal amp where the input goes straight to the volume pot, you can't do that. So that being said, so we have some kind of conversion to single-ended, and apparently, and we have an amplification circuit or circuits in here. I'm not entirely sure how this is set up. Normally you have like a buffer and output and an op amps or something like that, and a standard 2-stage amplification stage. The output here is using Texas Instruments OPA 564s, which are rated at 1.5 watts each, and I guess in balance they've managed to get them to go to 3.5 watts combined, and managed to keep the linearity, which is pretty impressive. And I guess all stuff tends to have specs which are slightly below what they're capable of for obvious reasons, and they've done that here. There's also the gain stages connected in directly here. I guess these could be the gain resistors connected to gain, and of course this appears to be could well be single-ended as well, which probably says much about what's going on. Then we have this output, of course, goes to balanced or single-ended, but that's kind of how the THX seems to work. And of course, one part of this will be the feed forward circuit. I'm not quite sure which is the negative feedback circuit. It could be this one, or it could be part of this built in here. Apologies that I don't know in detail. I'm not an electrical engineer, but it's interesting to look at inside how these things work, and be interesting to see what happens if you did connect a couple of capacitors up there. It might help a little bit with the sensor dynamics that you get compared to more expensive amps. Speaking of that,
the dynamics were kind of what I noticed the main difference between the 789 and other amps. But to start with, the sound as such, it's built to be very low distortion, and that kind of perception came through very clearly. It had a very signature of just getting straight out of the way of the music. The music came through, and the signature of, say, the DAC I was using came through very cleanly. It has what I call a low distortion smoothness. That is, some people consider smoothness as meaning like rolled off in the treble or something like that. Nothing like that, but a complete lack of any harshness or anything unpleasant in the sound. Although I've seen some people say that they thought there was something funky about the mid-range. I didn't experience that with the 789. It would be something to check out all the same. I would have liked to have used it with a better power supply again to see if it made any difference, but I didn't have a chance to do that, and I could only go on what I have set up here. But one thing I did notice that the sound quality is very, very good, and it was such that I could clearly make out the difference between the sources that I used, whether I used the little Modi multi-bit or the Bifrost, which I reviewed recently, or went up to the Yggdrasil. I could clearly make out which DAC I was using and the kind of different characteristics of that DAC when I was listening. Now, I tried also direct out of the Hugo 2, which is about the best sound quality you can get in something, it's $2,500, versus out of the Hugo 2 connected through the 789. Now, you think there'd be absolutely no difference, but with the best recordings I had, level matched, I did notice a tiny bit of detail loss going through the 789, and again, there's something to consider that the measurements taken of these devices do use signals that do not relate directly to music. They are just test signals. So when it comes to and this is where I think maybe it comes down to my impressions versus much more expensive amps. So I compared it to Audio GD's Master 9. I compared it to the Holo Audio Azure, which I've reviewed. Now those amps are something like 3 to 4 times the price. I mean, the Holo Spring Azure is $1,600, so 4 times the price. And the difference in sound quality was only a little bit in my experience. So it wasn't a huge jump up, certainly nowhere near 4 times the jump up. And it just spoke of the great value that the 789 is, that there's only a little bit of an increase in sound quality. And I'm sure someone's going to ask me, is it worth jumping up from a 789 to something like a Master 9 or a Holo Azure or some other amp along those range? And probably my answer would be, if the jump is pocket change for you and it's not going to affect your budget much, maybe it would be, but if it is a big deal, probably not. And I think in that sense, a lot of people will be considering, there's a lot of drop shoppers that consider that they will use it with an inexpensive DAC, and it will reveal the quality or lack thereof of that inexpensive DAC. So in that, it definitely wouldn't be those kind of people. If you're one of those kind of people, you wouldn't be considering the jump up and you want to consider the best value, well then definitely this is one of the best value amps I've ever experienced, and it's really pushed the something called the law of diminishing returns up a great deal. And that kind of law of diminishing returns states that the more to get an increase in, early on in low amounts of money, the increase in sound quality goes up at about the same rate as the price does, but after a certain point it kind of drops off, and for every maybe extra $1,000 you're only getting like a 5% difference in sound quality. That's starting to really hit now at the $400 to $500 mark. After that, you're starting to spend a lot more money to get only a little bit of an increase in sound quality. The other factor, of course, is music. A lot of music out there that especially even I listen to, which sounds great, and if I'm listening to my car stereo, doesn't sound so great when you hear the lack of recording quality or lack of mastering quality through a high-end system. So those factors to consider as well. One of the things is that being that difference being so small, I did also, and this is going to annoy some people to say this, but I did try comparing going from the Yggdrasil through to the 789 using cheap cables and then using expensive cables, and I did notice a significant difference, at least for me. So it speaks mostly, and I say this not to talk about cables, but to talk about the sound quality that is available out of this 789. It did a fantastic job. I think the main difference between the sound quality of this, apart from, and say a Master 9 or the Holo Spring Azure, was not so much that there's maybe a tiny bit of an increase in a detailed retrieval, but the main thing was kind of the sense of dynamics. The dynamics being, of course, the how, like if someone hits a drum, if you actually have been up close to a drum being hit, actually the dynamics are really powerful. It really does smack you. And you don't get that, you especially don't get that with headphones. I've only heard one pair of headphones that can reproduce that accurately, actually, and that was the $3,500 RAL ribbon headphones. But the sense of dynamics was greater out of the better amps, such as the Master 9 and the Holo Spring Azure, and the sense of space was better out of the Holo Spring Azure. It has gives a very good sense of space, whereas the Audio GD amps for kind of a slightly flatter and textbook neutral kind of presentation. And also there's been adding to that a bit of extra detail out of the Holo Spring Azure made it the better amp, but again 4 times the price. And I've seen also some people, they want to save money, and also because they might have spent a lot of money on something like an Yggdrasil, like the one I have behind me, and they don't want to, maybe they're saving up for a Ragnarok or saving up for something like a Master 9 or a HE9, and they don't want to spend a huge amount of money. They want something to tie them over, or something that will be good enough until they can get the dream system that they want, and they might consider the 789, and for that will fill in very, very nicely. So it was, compared to other amps in its price range, I've just had the Asgard 3 here. The Asgard 3 is, again, it's $200, half the price, but you can also get it for $400 with a DAC. It was a little bit behind the 789. The 789 was noticeably clearer. The Asgard and the cheaper shit amps like the, I've got a Magni sitting up there, kind of have a very, the soundstage is wide, but the depth is very flat. But in terms of drive, it does drive headphones very well. The 789 drives headphones quite incredibly well. You have that huge variety of choice. You have low gain, which will drive even sensitive IMs very, very well. Medium, all headphones I tried were excellent. You've got your usual drop options such as the 6XX and 7XX, and on high gain it would power through even Susvaras actually quite decently. It's not going to quite do what a speaker amp does, but when I did need really high gain, it did a very admirable job and stayed very clean and clear while listening. So if you're considering it as something better than say a $200 or $99 or $200 or thereabouts amp, it definitely does the job. And if you're considering you don't want to even consider spending over $1,000 on an amp, it will probably give a run for the money of anything up to $1,000 and maybe a bit over, depending how things go. But at the same time, the penalty of that is I would avoid using any really cheap balanced DACs. And it's a bit of a diversion. I do want to talk about that. A lot of cheap, especially from China, a lot of cheap balanced DACs come out, and people think, oh, balanced is so important. Absolutely not. If you consider these things are made down to a price, if you have to keep a price of a product down to a certain level, if you consider that balanced circuitry out of a DAC isn't going to give a vastly big increase in sound quality. It is just not going to happen. What happens is actually more likely to be the opposite. As to keep the price down to that level, to provide a balanced circuit, you have to provide not one amplification circuit, but double it to make it balanced. That means you need double the components, double the costs for the amplification circuit, and what's going to be sacrificed? Probably the power supply. And if the power supply is sacrificed, it's more likely to have a lower sound quality. Now, the best DAC I have here is single-ended. And this is why it's also important that the fact that this is single-ended internally makes no difference whatsoever. Balance is not some magical thing that makes things all the more better. I mean, the single-ended out was perfectly good with anything within the required power range. 1.5 watts of single-ended output is going to be way above any volume level you're likely to listen at, unless you have, again, something like the Hi-Fi Man's HE6 or Susvaras. For most amps, you probably won't even use anywhere near 0.5 watt of power, so it actually will be quite sufficient as it is. And again, the best amp I have here is single-ended. So I advise strongly, if you do consider, and this is something people do ask me, what DAC should I buy with something like a 789? I will buy the best single-ended DAC you can afford. Or if you can afford something like a Bifrost 2, or maybe even an Yggdrasil, if you can afford an Yggdrasil, I would consider getting that if it doesn't become a major financial burden. I never recommend overspending on stuff. Food and clothes are more important. So in overall value, Dropper provided a excellent amp overall. It really, feature-wise as well, it's not just the magic circuit, but the whole setup could make this an endgame amp, an inexpensive endgame amp for many people who don't want to go dig deep into their pockets to get an excellent hi-fi system. And it worked really well with everything I plugged into it, even up to very, very expensive Utopias, and I've got Ether 2s here as well in for review. And even when I wanted to plug in IEMs, it did fantastically. So that is the Drop THX AAA 789. And if you do have any questions, comments, good or bad, or actually constructive criticism is welcome as well, let me know below. Thumbs up, and do subscribe if you want to see more of my reviews of various products. I have some other things floating around here, such as these mice spheres and the cost system from Drop as well in for review. Also, don't forget that these videos are supported primarily by my viewers. So if you consider giving me a thank you by supporting me, you can buy stuff through Amazon, links on my videos. You can actually become a supporter for a month or two, and it's like buying me a cup of coffee. And in return, I'll give you, if you have any questions or need some advice on purchasing stuff, I'll happily help you out. And I'll also let you see the videos and my impressions of new gear before everyone else. To do that, check out the link in the link that you can see on screen or in the description. And thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.